So, good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm Saul Tendler, the University's Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here today. As you'll know, the University has been marking Holocaust Memorial Day for many years. It's normally recognised on the 27th of January, which isn't today. A curious observation, but we're marking it as a series of different events. And I think traditionally we do that by holding talks and discussions. The Holocaust Memorial Day itself comes on the day of the liberation of Auschwitz, and it's important to recognise that event, but indeed the many other genocides that have occurred in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, many other countries, unfortunately. Each year the Holocaust Memorial Trust selects a theme, a provocation for discussion, and this year their theme is ordinary people. And it's clear to me that many, if not all, of the victims of genocide were ordinary people. Part of the provocation suggests that the perpetrators were ordinary people. And I must admit, when I read my notes for this, I personally had some difficulty with that. I'm not sure ordinary people commit mass genocide, but I'm not sure that they kill and rape and maim. But I look forward to understanding the position of the Holocaust Memorial Trust in more detail. I'm delighted that we're today joined by Professor Rebecca Clifford from the University of Durham. And in a couple of moments I'll hand over to my colleague Lisa Peschel, Dr. Lisa Peschel, who's a senior lecturer here at the university. And I know that we're looking forward to hearing more about important voices and stories of some of those ordinary people who were profoundly affected by Nazi persecution. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Lisa from our School of Arts and Creative Technologies. Before Lisa came to York, she held a number of prestigious positions at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard University, and she has a special interest in identity and subjectivity. And I've certainly enjoyed hearing many talks from Lisa about her work of arts and culture in camps. So, thank you. Welcome, Rebecca. Welcome, Lisa, and look forward to your conversation.
So thank you very much for that introduction, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Rebecca Clifford. She's Professor of Transnational European History at Durham University, and the book that we'll be discussing tonight, Survivors, Children's Lives After the Holocaust, was shortlisted for the 2021 Wolfson History Prize and a finalist for the 2021 Cundill History Prize, and was named a Book of the Year by the Daily Telegraph and the Globe and the Mail. So it is our privilege to hear about this tonight, and it is my especial pleasure to be speaking with you and to be chairing this event because, as Saul mentioned, my own research is on the arts in the ghettos and camps, specifically on theater in the Theresienstadt ghetto, which is a site that we share interest in. In fact, our research intersects in several ways that are fascinating to me. We're both looking at survivors and how they make sense of their wartime experiences. Again, the Theresienstadt ghetto, that's my site because it had such an active cultural life, but you also work with several survivors of Theresienstadt because of their outstanding childcare program. It has one of the highest rates of child survival of any camp or ghetto. And we're also looking at really specific populations. I'm looking at survivors who were in their early 20s at the end of the war, who stayed in their own country, Czechoslovakia, and have vivid memories, not only of their pre-war lives and of the ghetto, but even of these fictional versions of their lives that they've created in the theater. Whereas you're looking at survivors who were under 10 years of age when the war ended, so very young children who you can trace through both archival and oral testimony, and who left Europe after the war, which means they lost their original language and culture, and in some cases have no memories at all of it. Maybe just the faintest impressions of their lives before and during the war. And some of them were adopted by families who, with the best of intentions, wanted them to forget even that. So I'd like to begin by asking you, what inspired you to write this book?
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, Saul. Yes, I'd love to tell you a bit about what inspired me to write this book. I will just start by telling you that this is a book that follows 100 children who survived the Holocaust through their post-war lives, through all 7 decades of their post-war lives, from 1945 through to the present, really. So that was my approach, and that's what I've tried to do in the book. And yet, what brought me to write the book, there was an intellectual reason, I suppose you could say, and there was a personal reason as well. And the intellectual one was more important, so I'll tell you a bit about that. I've been an oral historian throughout my whole career, and what that means, if you don't know, is that I do a lot of my research by interviewing people about their lives, or I listen to interviews that others have done. And it's actually my favorite part of my job. I love talking to people about their lives. And I've done hundreds and hundreds of interviews in my career. Not all of them on the Holocaust, although many of them. When I was a postdoctoral researcher, I was involved in a project that actually was about activism in the 1960s. And that was a wonderful project, and we did a lot of interviews for that project. So I was doing, kind of significant numbers of interviews in a very short period, and I started to think to myself, that there's a pattern to how we tell the story of our lives. If I go to interview any of you in this room, if I interview Lisa, I say, tell me the story of your life. You're very likely to start by saying, well, my parents were X, and I was born in Y. You tell me about your parents, your hometown, your community of origin. And as I listened to all these interviews that weren't anything to do with the Holocaust, I kept thinking to myself, gosh, if that's how we root our stories, if that's the origin point, what happens if you don't know? If you don't know, you've never met your parents, you don't remember your hometown, you can't put that together, then how do you make sense of who you are? And that actually was the intellectual thing that brought me to this. In fact, I've got a little excerpt from the book that I want to read to you because it's about that. Young children's experiences shed light on a question with profound repercussions. How can we make sense of our lives when we do not know where we come from? Because their pre-war memories were indistinct or even non-existent, and because there was often no living adult able or willing to fill in the key details of their earliest days and years, these child survivors often faced a decades-long struggle to assemble the tale of their origins, a simple but essential act of autobiography, fundamental to identity. I have to say I didn't really understand just how far that is true until I worked on this book. If you can't recount the story of your own family, your hometown, or your formative experiences, how do you make sense of your childhood and its impacts? What work do you have to do to explain who you are? Most of us take for granted that we can make at least some sense of our childhood memories. We do not often stop to think of this as a privilege. At its core, this book explores what it means to grow up and to grow older when you do not have that advantage and are forced by your circumstances to weave the story of your past from scraps. It is a book about the Holocaust, but more fundamentally, it's a book about the history of living after and living with a childhood marked by chaos. Most of us can tell the story of our lives from the beginning through to the present, because others have helped us to build the narrative. Our parents, families, and communities, the collective and social context in which we live, provide the detail that we can't remember or explain and help us to contextualize memories that we hold in our mind's eye but might otherwise struggle to interpret. The life story of child survivors are fascinating in part because the social world was rent asunder for them. The parents, relatives, and communities that would normally play this crucial role were not there to do the job. In their absence, children were left with memories that they could not interpret and stories of their early lives that were peppered with holes. As they grew, they had to piece things together for themselves, chasing down documents, photos, and living relatives flung far and wide in diaspora, all in order to be able to answer the most fundamental of questions: who am I? So that was actually the impetus for working on this particular group. And there was a personal reason as well. My mother's an infant survivor of the Holocaust, born in 1944. So she has absolutely no memory of this event that so deeply went on to shape her life. So there was absolutely, I am not shy to confess, a part of me that just wanted to understand my mother's own experience better. And I did. I see it in a totally different light now that I've worked on the book.
I'm going to ask a question that is not on the
Yeah, go for it. It's a conversation. We did agree the questions in advance, but sometimes we go off piste.
What was her process of watching you research and write this book? I mean, knowing that this is her own experience.
Oh my goodness, Lisa, we could have a whole conversation on that one. At first, she kept saying things like, "I'm very proud of you, but I don't really want to know what you're doing. Don't tell me about the book, but it's great that you're writing the book." Because, I encountered a really interesting mix of child survivors in the book. Some who really wanted to talk about their experiences, and others, like my mother, who really did not. But my goodness, has she ever gone through a transformation? I've been working on this book since, well, it's finished now. Since 2014, so it's been a while. Oh, and she had an experience that it turns out actually was quite a common experience during the lockdown, because she was stuck at home and she was alone. She spent a lot of time trying to put together a family tree. Now, I know that actually it turns out a lot of the survivors in the book did exactly the same thing. And because they were all stuck at home. And it's so easy now to do genetic testing. So a lot of them were doing these cheek swabs and kind of putting together these family trees and finding relatives they didn't know existed. So here's my mother doing exactly the same thing. Suddenly, she's out giving talks about her childhood. She's calling herself a child survivor. What the devil happened? But it's happened over the period since lockdown. So I changed and she changed.
And your book perfectly supports her endeavor.
And bless her, the book is dedicated to her. It's not about her in any sense. She is not one of the children in the book. But I've given her a copy, and I think she will probably never read it, which I understand. Some things are too raw. With your mother's situation and with so many others in the book, it seems they really do, and we'll talk a little bit more about the nature of child memory in a few minutes, but that they really have no memories, or maybe the vaguest of memories, so that the only thing they have is the post-war as their personal experience. Yeah. So what particularly interested you in the post-war lives of the survivors? Yeah, I think broadly, the post-war lives of all survivors, not just child survivors, we really haven't looked at them enough. I feel quite strongly about that because I think there's a problem with that. Because if we want to understand what are the short and long-term repercussions of genocide in a person's life, we need to look at those lives through all the decades since the end of the war, the decades since the end of any genocide that we look at. So that was part of the impetus. I really wanted to do a kind of longue durée account of that looked at this group of people, these 100 children, obviously not children anymore, and just followed them through the arc of their lives to see, okay, what happened. And there's this other impetus, I suppose. So as an oral historian, since probably the 1990s, I think, we've talked about something we would call the boundary crossing. So when you go to interview somebody, and maybe some of you in the room have had this wonderful experience of doing this kind of interviewing, we often know what we want to get out of the interview, and then the person we're interviewing often thinks they know what we want to hear, if that makes sense. So they've often started to formulate the story. In the case of a child Holocaust survivors, they've often told the story before. And that makes for a kind of practiced account, which it can be wonderful. There's nothing wrong with that inherently. But there is a kind of magic that happens when you go outside of that practiced account, or don't quite end up talking about the thing you thought you were going to talk about. So, we call it the boundary crossing. When you get up to the boundary of the story and go over, and some surprising stuff comes out. So part of my thinking was, well, this group of people I'm interviewing, they're used to being asked about what happened to them during the war. But I wanted to say, what's happened to you since? And actually, that was really interesting because they often weren't expecting it, and they couldn't fathom why I cared. I got a lot of, well, why would you want to know about that? I've had a really ordinary life. You don't want to talk about that. You want to talk to somebody else. I'm not the right person for you. But in my mind, if you've had such an extraordinary childhood, and then you've gone on to have an ordinary life, that is interesting and remarkable in and of itself, and it deserves to be studied, and we need to unpick what ordinary means. We need to look at what that looks like. So that was the other reason behind it. I think it led to some very surprising responses.
Well, this is one of the things that impressed me so much about the book, and I did read it. I could tell your mother.
Unlike my mother, yes.
But that, tracing them through the decades, and not only how they change as they're going through the different periods of their lives, but how psychologists' notions of what does survival mean change. The question, who is a survivor, changes, and we'll come to that in a minute. But I would like to ask, why did you choose this particular very specific group? So you limited it to people who were under 10 at the end of the war, who you could find information about them through the archives and through oral history, and they had to be those who had left Europe, so had left their homelands.
So it's almost like there was sort of these three criteria. Well, first of all, when you have a very large group, you need to select some criteria. Sometimes it's a bit random, but there are three different reasons why I made those choices. So I have only looked at children who were 10 or younger in 1945. And there was a very deliberate reason for that. It's not because I think that the experiences of older children are not important, of course not. But it's because I really, really wanted to dig into this question of what happens when you can't remember those early years and you don't have anybody to kind of help you piece it together. Whereas for teenage survivors, of course, they could remember. That has a very different effect, sometimes a very much harder effect. But I really just wanted to dig into that question. Here are children who were in continental Europe during the war, who experienced persecution directly. So, for example, you won't find Kindertransport children in the book, not because I don't think they're survivors, of course they are, but because I really wanted to have these children who had physically experienced what it was like to live through, in a ghetto, in a camp, in hiding, but could not really remember it. They could either remember nothing of it, or they could remember fragments of it, which they couldn't make sense of, because that was really, letting me get into that question of, okay, what do you do with those fragmentary memories, or that absence of memory? So that was the decision on the age. The question then of why children who could be found in both the archives and the oral record. Well, I've got a story about that actually. When I started working on the book, I had only a very vague sense of what I was doing. I will be honest, I was a little bit sarcastic around in the dark. And I spent 6 months doing research for the book at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., which was a really wonderful time. And I owe so much to one of the fabulous librarians in the archive there, because in my first couple of days, we were talking about documents, and he said, okay, Rebecca, what would be your ideal document? I thought, wow, that's a great question. I don't really know. So I had to go away and have a bit of a think about it. And then I went back to him and I said, okay, in a perfect world, I would want to find a collection that would let me kind of dip into the life of one child survivor through a long period of time, like decades. So, a personal collection that would allow me to kind of take a sample test of his or her life at different points. And so Ron, the librarian, said, okay, I'll see what I can find. So he went and had a good troll through their catalog, and he said, I think I found something. And he went into the storage room and he came back with a box. And he said, see if this is any good. It's a personal collection from a woman named Felice Zed. So in the end, Felice Zed sort of became one of the superstars of the book, as it were. So I opened it up, and there were letters written by Felice's parents when they were in an internment camp in the south of France. I'm going to read you a little bit about Felice in a bit. And there were photographs of Felice with the woman who rescued her, who she loved so much. And there were photographs of her as a young woman in her 20s going back to France to find that rescuer again. And there were her own accounts, several different accounts written at different points in time. It was the most remarkable collection that let me see this one woman's life all through kind of, it's in 1942 and 1958. There was all this material there. So I could really kind of say, wow, this is her reflecting on her past through her life. And I went back to Ron and I said, this is it. This is what I want. I want more like this. There was no more. That was the only one that I ever found like that. But it was so great because it gave me kind of heads up that it could be done. So then I realized I didn't need the collections to exist. I could make the collections. I could start with a case report from 1946, pull up the name of the survivor, go out searching with that name to find that they'd given an interview in 1982, or they'd written a letter that had ended up in the collection in 1963. And then pulling those threads, I could put together a collection. So it allowed me to see the span of their lives. There's another thing, I suppose, which is I teach history, and I often encounter in student essays it's this kind of assumption we have about archival documents, that they are truthful, but oral history is full of forgetting and possible falsehoods and justifications, so that you have to be careful with oral history in a way you don't with archives. I'm constantly telling students that is not quite true, but what I found in the case of this book, actually, is that the oral record did cling very carefully to the facts as far as they can be known. It was the archival record that was just full of falsehoods. And there are good reasons for that. For example, there was a program, a British program, to bring 1,000 concentration camp survivor orphans to Britain in 1945-46. In the end, about 700 came. And that program only admitted orphans. Well, the children who were trying to get out of DP camps or whatever in Europe, who wanted to come to Britain, there was a similar program that ran in my native Canada, they knew that the only way to get out was to be an orphan. So whether they were an orphan or not, they often told the story of being an orphan. And that, was taken down verbatim and went into their case files. And if you go into the archives, you'll find it still today. If you weren't comparing the material you find in the case reports to the later oral history, you wouldn't know that that's completely made up. But there were absolutely understandable and justifiable reasons for that. Indeed, I think any of us could understand that a program to save children that wouldn't also save their parents was a cruel program. And we had any child had very good reasons to lie, to get themselves out of dangerous situation in camps in Europe and to safety. But it's remarkable how much you find children lying in the archives. And so I think that's just one of the other wonderful reasons to compare. And I'm lucky to be able to do it. You can't do it with everything.
No, and the way that you've managed to pull together these threads of individual survivors across decades is one of the things I enjoyed most about
I tell you what, it was really fun. It was like it was the best of history, because it was like a detective hunt. Once you had the name, you could search. It's amazing. You couldn't do it for many other historical events, but because these children so often ended up in care of some variety, there's an incredible archival record about their post-war movements, and that's just not true for so many other events in history. So this one might have been something of a unique case.
You know, there's a question, time is going quickly.
See, it happens.
There's one question I really want to make sure we get to, because when we talked about this, I was absolutely mesmerized by this aspect of your research. Could you talk a bit about your research on the changing nature of memory as it applies to children, and these really special conditions that apply to the kids the age you're researching?
Yes, okay, I'm just going to go off piece of the notes. So I'm not a psychologist, and I didn't know a great deal about child psychology actually before I worked on this project, but I knew I needed to understand the nature of memory in children. So at the very beginning I went into the university library, and I just actually sat down in the child psychology section, and I read everything I could find about memory development in children. And some of you in the audience may know this area much better than me, but I find this absolutely fascinating, because we still do not understand this phenomenon that Freud called infantile amnesia, which means that we do not remember the first 3 or so years of our lives. You may believe that you remember something, but you don't. You do not directly remember that time. You might remember that later you recalled it, or that later you talked about it with somebody, but we don't have access to those early years, not in a direct sense. We don't know why. But some really wonderful and exciting research was done by some experimental psychologists in the 1980s and 1990s, trying to understand, what is it that makes the change? What is it that makes children start to encode memories? And so the first kind of theory about this had to do with language, because of course around that age of 3, you're starting to properly gear up to use language, using it in a more coherent way. And so first there were some sort of theories about, well, maybe it has to do with language acquisition. But from there, these psychologists pushed further and thought, what if it's not just language? What if language is the tool, but there's other things going on? And so they were doing kind of laboratory experiments around this. And they found that, or they argued, that one of the things that makes a big difference is learning to tell the story of who you are. So learning the autobiographical narrative. You're not born knowing how to tell who you are, and it's actually quite culturally specific, what we might say about ourselves. You learn it because somebody teaches you, and that person or those people are your parents in most cases. You're having conversations, you're 3 years old, you're talking to your parents, and they're saying, oh, do you remember that time we went to the zoo and we did this? And you're learning how to tell the story of events that are meaningful. So you can see already that that has some big implications for a group like child survivors who, first of all, probably have not held on to their original language, sometimes have had to go through several different languages to get wherever they end up. And second of all, do not have access, in many cases, to that social world of memory. That's what allows me to remember my childhood. It's actually that world around. And it's just, I think I took it for granted until I did this research. But for so many of them, they're left with these fragments they cannot piece together because there's no one to help. That doesn't mean that they did not have a living parent, but in many cases means that living parent didn't want to talk about it. So it's not necessarily that they lost everybody, but in some cases simply that it was a conversation that could not happen in families.
I'll come back to the question then that you've just set up, that this book is about piecing together a lost past and how these people try to figure out who they are across the span of decades. How do child survivors make sense of their experiences, and what happens when they can't?
So it is a book about trying to make sense of your past over time, and it's also about the limitations of that. There have been 7 post-war decades, and there's a lot of survivors in the book who still don't know very basic things about their own pasts. And they won't know now, because this is a great group of people, I have to say. I was so moved by how dedicated they were to being historians of themselves, doing what I do in the archives, going into the archives and digging up material on their own lives. So for many of those who I interviewed for the book, you know, they've hit the end of the road. They've done everything they can to find out everything they can, and they still often don't know very basic facts. I've got, there's one, some of them I really became very close to, and there's one survivor who appears a lot in the book, Jackie. All he wanted was to have a photograph of his mother. And he searched for decades, and you'd think in the modern world there's surely a photograph of everybody somewhere. But he's never found that photograph, so I think he's accepting now that he's learned a lot and he's not going to know what his mother looked like. And I think even when you do know most of the facts, sometimes you still really struggle to put it together into a coherent narrative. And so the book is also a story about gaps and silences and absences. And I actually think one of the things I learned writing it was that I think it's true for everybody. Like, child survivors are kind of extreme slice of a far more common experience. But for anybody who's had a traumatic childhood or a chaotic childhood, or even, you know, if you've been adopted or in foster care, there are many pathways to having that struggle to piece together your childhood and what it means. So I hope the book actually highlights how much disjuncture is part of the human experience. I think, look, this week is sort of Holocaust Memorial Week, and there will be child survivors all across Britain going out and doing talks for Holocaust Memorial Day. A lot of the survivors in the book, they will dedicate this whole end of January to doing this, and they're really, really committed, and they put a huge amount of their own energy and resources into it. And when they go out to do those kind of talks with audiences just like you know, they know the audience wants to hear a story that makes sense, right? And maybe even a story that has some kind of cathartic value to it. And so that's probably the story a lot of them give, but that's not the only story.
Yeah.
That can actually be a very limiting story in a lot of ways. And you know, in kind of our private conversations, a lot of them said, I'm sick of telling that story. Because the story about me not knowing and me being frustrating and all the holes in my story, that's actually that's true too.
And that's the kind of boundary crossing make with you.
That's
I tell
right,
you,
yeah.
these are the things I can't know, and maybe I'm losing hope
Yeah.
of ever knowing. On behalf of your survivors, I'm hoping more people take the 23andMe test, so that maybe they can trace some relatives.
Yeah.
But I'll just ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So you mentioned, audiences expect certain things sometimes of survivors. Who is a child survivor? How did this term come to be? Why did some children not even see themselves as survivors? And then what does the audience expect from a survivor when they tell their testimony?
So I didn't really understand until I worked on the book just how fraught this term survivor has historically been. For a really long time, I mean, if you go back to kind of before the 1980s, you would find the term Holocaust survivor, but you would probably only find it in relation to a concentration camp survivor. So there was already a really firm idea that surviving a concentration camp made you a survivor. Of course, very few children, I mean, there are children in the book who survived concentration camps, but they are not the majority. Most children survived in hiding. And then it was an emotionally very fraught term. I'll never forget sitting down to read some really interesting newspaper clippings, actually, from a really important event. I'm going to read you about the event in a second, in a little excerpt. So in 1983, there was the first ever international gathering of Holocaust survivors. It was in Washington, D.C., 30,000 survivors. It was the biggest event ever of its kind. And so, of course, all the kind of major American national newspapers were there and interviewing survivors. And I was really very struck by some of these interviews because a lot of survivors kept saying things like, it's so nice to be here with each other because, you know, out in the world when you say you're a survivor, you know that people are judging you because everybody believes that if you survived a concentration camp, you must have done something bad. So we've come so far, we don't think that way anymore. It's hard to imagine. There was a time not that long ago when most people's assumption about a concentration camp survivor was that they must have done something immoral to survive. So these survivors were all together in this place, and I think it's probably worth just reading the excerpt, actually, because it's about my dear Felice, whose wonderful collection I held there and thought, this archive must be full of collections like this, and it was only hers. It was only hers. I suppose what I was going to say before that was that a lot of child survivors never thought to call themselves that. In fact, that term child survivor only appears in the mid-1980s. Instead, what a lot of children were kind of told was this discourse around being lucky. Oh, you're not a survivor, you're lucky, you know, you're lucky, you're alive, most other children are dead, so just focus on your future and try not to think about it too much. It was an awful lot of these children had that experience of being told that. So, the assumption that children could and would forget the past and focus on the future, that they were lucky and that this luck would be enough to silence memory, took a long time to fade. It was child survivors themselves who eventually challenged it, but it was a challenge that took decades to mature. We see this in the story of Felice Z. In 1983, Felice was only beginning to learn who she was. The year before, at the age of 42, she had finally received confirmation that her parents had been killed in Auschwitz. The family, Felice's parents, David and Lydia, her older sister Beata, then 3 years old, and Felice, who was only 1 year old, had been deported from the little town of Waldern in the Baden area of Germany to the internment camp of Gurs in the south of France. The two small girls had been rescued from the camp by the Red Cross and hidden with French Catholic families until the liberation. So you remember I told you that in this box there was letters that Felice's parents had written and pictures of her, the woman who rescued her. Felice had been trying since her early 20s to trace the details of her own early years and of her parents' lives and deaths, but there were still holes in her understanding. She struck up the courage to attend the first American gathering of Jewish Holocaust survivors, the largest meeting of Holocaust survivors ever held, which took place in April 1983 in Washington, D.C. Hoping to meet others with similar stories, but uncertain of where her own story fit into the broader context of surviving the Holocaust, Felice braved the criticism of older survivors who told her, "You were a child. What do you know? You don't remember." Speaking with a volunteer who recorded a short interview with her at the gathering, her frustration exploded, and this is from her interview. She said, "People don't understand. It's very hard for me to talk about it. I don't belong. I didn't go to a camp. I didn't suffer in that way. There was nothing to show for it. I felt I'm not a survivor. But then I thought, well, I am a survivor. In my own way. I mean, my parents died. My whole family died. Besides my sister and myself, everyone is gone." We now take a broad view of what constitutes survival in the Holocaust, and who might call themselves a survivor. But the accepted definitions were once far narrower. For many decades after the war, a survivor was understood primarily to mean a concentration camp survivor, a category that excluded the majority of child survivors and many adult survivors as well. The figure of the camp survivor had a cultural power that was reinforced by public opinion, but was also policed by camp survivors themselves, who were not eager to see those they imagined had suffered less dilute the potency of this notion of survival. Child survivors had to fight not only against external criticism of older survivors, but also an internal voice that suggested they weren't really survivors, but just fortunate kids. That their war experiences were in some way less authentic than those of camp survivors. Nicole D., who in 1991 organized the first international meeting of children who had been hidden during the Holocaust, has observed that one can never break into the hierarchy of suffering. It's only recently that child survivors had taken on the role that not so long ago were the preserve of older survivors. And a lot of this will be happening this week. They often speak to school students, they volunteer at museums and exhibits, they give talks for Holocaust Memorial Day. 75 years after the end of the war, it's more now, they have finally been recognized as survivors, and there is a clear rationale behind the shift. They are the only ones left. And actually Felice, you know, she gives this, it was a remarkable thing, because I think somebody was literally just randomly going around with a microphone and massive big like reel-to-reel recording equipment in 1983.
Yeah.
Just taking stories. There's hundreds of them in the archives. And so I think somebody literally just shoved a microphone in her face, and she didn't have time to think about it and said, "Why are you here?" And she's like, "Oh." And so she tells the story so raw in her own voice. It's like, well, I'm not sure I should be here because I'm really, like, it's like the light bulb's going on. She's like, I'm really not a survivor because I wasn't in a camp. But hold on a second, what am I then? Because I am the only one. Am I or am I not? And then she's actually caught on a second go. So there's 2 interviews. There's one where it's just her.
Yeah.
And there's a second one with her and some other guys she happens to be standing with. And by that time, she's had a little moment to think about it. And she's like, well, you know, the problem is I don't have a tattoo on my arm. She keeps saying it, as I've got nothing to show. I've got nothing to show for the pain. What can I do to prove that I'm a survivor too? But that was the miracle of her box, because in it, you can see her own thought process developing. And by the end, there's this memoir that she's sort of written, this little memoir in which she says, I am a child survivor. I was like, well, this is the whole journey that she had to take to be able to call herself that.
And to be able to assume that identity.
Yeah.
And it's an identity associated with a certain measure of pride and also with a duty to the future, which the survivors in your book take very seriously.
Yes.
It's time to open this up to questions. If you have a question, do raise your hand, and please do wait until someone with a microphone gets to you so we can be sure to record the question. Please, gentleman in the dark blue.
Thank you very much. Could I ask if there was any pattern in your research to the sort of crests and troughs of appetite to know about the past? So was that external circumstances, global events, political circumstances, milestones in people's lives? Were there patterns that dictated or determined people's own individual appetite?
Yes, that is a wonderful question. Thank you. You know, the truth is there was what I was expecting to find, and there's what I found, and they're not the same thing. I expected, as a historian who's done a lot of work on kind of like, you know, cultural memory, I expected that you'd get the big crest, I suppose, at the time when there was the most public interest in the Holocaust. That's actually not what I found. What I found was that the sort of dramatic moments had much more to do with the life cycle. And this was really very illuminating for me. So the moments when survivors really had to have a reckoning with their past happened when their first child was born, when they got married, when they got divorced, when their parents died, whether biological or adoptive. At these big moments that are actually part of all of our lives, that's when they had to reconsider their past. And it makes complete sense. A lot of them talk about, you know, I was going along do-do-do and I wasn't thinking about all this too much, but then my first child was born. And when she was the age that I was when I last saw my mother, I had a crisis. And there's actually one fantastic woman in the book who I became very close to who said, for a year, she couldn't touch her daughter She gave her all these presents, and it was trying to show her affection. She couldn't touch her because it was the age that she had been when her mother had to put her into a rescue family, and it was just too much. And sometimes it was as simple as the fact that they had retired. So this actually, on my very, very first interview I did for the book, I sat down with this wonderful, wonderful survivor, Joanna, and I kind of tried to explain what I wanted to do, that I wanted to know how she had sort of thought about her past at different points in her life. And she's like, oh, well, I didn't really. I really, really didn't think about it until I retired. I didn't have time. You know, you're busy. You're trying to establish your career, and you're raising your children. You don't have time to think about this stuff. But when I retired, then I had time. And it seemed so obvious, but it wasn't obvious to me. I hadn't thought about that. I was like, wow, I want to retire. That sounds amazing. That I just hadn't assumed that it could be down to something so fundamental, I suppose. But it was, that pattern to the human life. That's what dictated it, much more than the world swirling all around, to my great surprise.
Other questions? One right there, and then one right down in front.
Thank you. So I've just started learning about how the first 3 years of a child's life has a huge impact on how they live their lives for the rest of their life. So I'm curious, did you find many stories about addiction or difficulties forming or maintaining relationships?
Mm-hmm. That is also a great question. I think I could probably say two different things. Very few of the survivors in this study, but they are not a representative group. I can say a bit more about that in a second. Very few of them talked about addiction. Many of them talked about difficulty forming relationships. That was absolutely a pattern. And that's why I said before that sometimes they have this moment of reckoning when they get divorced, because they have to, and for so many of them that's happening in the 70s and 80s, so it's a long time ago now. And they have this moment when they think, why am I so afraid of love? Why am I having so much trouble being in a loving relationship? Why is that making me want to run? In fact, it really was fascinating because they sometimes, in early interviews, there's interviewing projects that start in the 1980s, so it catches a lot of these child survivors right in that raw moment when sometimes their marriages are falling apart. And it's really interesting because they're kind of reflecting, often using the sort of almost, I want to say, pop psychology language of the time. A lot of them go into hypnosis therapy at that point. It's very trendy in the 80s, and especially if they find themselves in North America, to try to access those early years, and they're hugely disappointed because they can't, because hypnosis will not allow you to access your first 3 years. And they're trying to understand for themselves why it's all coming apart. But that is then a moment that's a really pivotal moment for them reassessing their lives. Of course, one of the things we might have talked about, we had all sorts of questions that we were going to explore, and there's never enough time to do all the questions, is who is in the book and who is not in the book. And I might say it because I think it speaks to your question, that of course the 100 children in the book are children who want to talk about their past. The ones who aren't in the book are the ones who don't want to talk about their past, right? Of course they can't be in the book. For a long time, I think I would have said my mother was one of them. And so if I had been able to access, to talk to that other group, the ones who have really struggled, would I find more addiction, for example? Almost certainly. However, I'm not convinced that psychological problems or mental illness, that there's any higher proportion in child survivors than simply in the average population.
All right, let's take the question down.
There's one right in the
front. Pardon?
And there's also a question there.
Trauma studies teach that when someone can document their trauma so that it's intelligible to both themselves and others, it's no longer trauma but the beginnings of recovery. I wondered if your book engages with any secondary sources or critics discussing trauma studies, and if so, what kind of points are they making?
It is a wonderful question, thank you. There is an entire chapter of the book called Trauma, and is to some degree about trauma studies. But it also is another way, I'm trying to find the right language for this. So in the 1980s, there was a lot of interest on the part of psychologists in child survivors. For the first time, child survivors found themselves being interviewed. And it was not always a comfortable relationship because the psychologists doing the interviewing were often looking for trauma in the stories of these children. But the children did not necessarily want their experiences to be kind of boiled down to trauma, and often sort of pushed back against this. It made some really uncomfortable interviewing situations, and also actually some quite comical ones, which I quote in the book. So it's a delicate balance, because, some of the stuff now would really strike us as very jarring. I'm thinking of a book that came out in 1983 on a particular group of child survivors that I'm actually writing my next book on. And it, on the dust jacket, I'm trying to remember the way it's phrased, but basically it gives the rationale for the book as saying, like, we understand that, it says something like, we understand that psychopaths often have really bad childhoods. So let's look at this group of people who had really bad childhoods and try to figure out why they're not psychopaths. And of course you can see that the children being interviewed took offense, basically, to this. And so it's a very complicated dance, I think, for child survivors of the concept of trauma. Both because they would, most of them, certainly in the book, would right away recognize that they have experienced traumatic events and they have had lasting repercussions in their lives from those traumatic events. But at the same time that their experiences it cannot be reduced to that, and that they have felt often the need to push back against that. So I think both that it is a very important concept, that trauma studies are very, very important in understanding that, and also that there's so much more. There was a question? Yeah.
I'm, I suppose, a very unusual person insofar as one of my relatives, Jutta, is a child survivor of a concentration camp, Theresienstadt. And she got out, she was alive at the end of the war. She came back with her mother to the apartment where they were taken from to the camp. So she came back, and the landlord said, "I'm so pleased to see you back safe." And from that point, she realized she could never trust an adult, because this landlord had said, "You're Jews, you can't come into the air raid shelter." And so he was basically two-faced. And so as a child, and I would like your comments on this, it's the relationship that wir waren Nachbarn, we were neighbors, but the neighbors were supposedly very friendly afterwards. They had been very anti-Semitic beforehand, and they were now trying to pretend what they were. And so this has stayed with her all her life. Who can she trust? Who can she talk to? And that must be awful, to be treated like that as a child.
Thank you for that really remarkable both comment and question. I think actually, in a way, it circles back to that earlier question about addiction and relationships, because that issue of who can you trust, I would absolutely say marks every life in this book. And I also have to admit, it's very prevalent in my own family. Not in a way that we ever had overt discussions about who can you trust. It was much more on the margins, and yet I think always there. And it took me actually years to realize that I am probably abnormal in thinking things like, ooh, if there was a crisis, who would I take my children to, you know? It took me writing this book to think, maybe that's not a normal kind of thought to have. I don't know. But I do think absolutely trust is a huge issue. And that question of the neighbors returning, well, there are not maybe so many children in this study who go back home afterwards, only because being so young, they often end up in and after the liberation in care in some way. But there are certainly, we were actually talking about it before we started, of the older, of the teenage child survivors of Theresienstadt, so many who literally walk home from the camp back to Poland, many of them from Poland or other parts of Czechoslovakia or wherever they're from, after the liberation of that camp, to discover that there's nothing left, that the neighbors have taken all their furniture and do not intend to give it back, that there is nothing materially or emotionally for them anymore. So they turn around and walk back to Theresienstadt, the camp, because they don't know where else to go. That is how, if anybody watched the wonderful kind of a docudrama that was on the BBC, I want to say last year, about the Windermere boys, if you've seen this. So those slightly older teenage boys would be among that group. That is how they end up in Britain, because some of them, you know, they try to go home, there's nothing, and they face these neighbors who have stolen everything, basically, and are not going to return it. So they turn right around and they walk back to Theresienstadt, and then from Theresienstadt, they're picked up by a group who wants to help. They're brought to a castle where they're cared for a couple of months. Then they're actually, I guess it's just about a month, then they're gathered together in Prague, and they come to Britain that way. I think that's a very hard thing to let go of. Absolutely.
And I'm really sorry to say our time is at an end. Thank you, everybody, for the phenomenal questions and attention, and I'd like to hand back to Saul Tendler to close our evening. I wish we could stay another half hour.
I always wish there was more.
Well, thank you. And I should offer a huge thank you to you, Rebecca and Lisa, for a really fascinating discussion and much to think about from many, many different perspectives. So we should thank you. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for talking about your book. And thank you for the insights of your work, your scholarly work, and you, Lisa, as well. So it's been hugely interesting. Before we formally thank you, let me say that copies of the book are available outside. Fox Lane Books, little independent bookseller, is in the lobby. So should you wish to have a signed copy, all you have to do is part with some money, and you can go home and read this fascinating work. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for joining us to mark a series of events around Holocaust Memorial Day, and there should be hot drinks outside and the opportunity to catch both Rebecca and Lisa. So, thank you.